When America's most beloved movie star crossed paths with one of daytime television's most dominant personalities, no one expected the exchange to derail so dramatically. What was meant to be a routine appearance turned into one of the most talked about moments in daytime TV when Julia Roberts sat down at The View and found herself in the middle of an unexpected and deeply uncomfortable confrontation. By the time it was over, the atmosphere had shifted from polite conversation to outright hostility, ending with Julia leaving the set in visible frustration and shock. The morning began like countless others at the familiar round table. Bright lights filled the studio, the audience buzzed with excitement, and the hosts settled into their seats with practiced ease. Julia Roberts was there to promote her newest film, an emotional story centered on family, forgiveness, and reconnection. Producers expected charm, laughter, and glowing praise for the project. Instead, they witnessed a conversation unravel in real time. Whoopi Goldberg welcomed Julia with a smile that seemed warm on the surface, though there was an underlying sharpness that some noticed immediately. Julia stepped onto the set wearing a soft-toned blazer, greeting the audience with her signature warmth. She took her seat beside Whoopi, relaxed and smiling, unaware that the tone of the discussion was about to shift dramatically. At first, everything felt normal. Julia spoke passionately about the film, describing the emotional depth of her character and the experience of working with the cast. Her enthusiasm was genuine, and the audience responded with applause and nods of approval. Yet, as the conversation continued, Whoopi began steering it away from the movie and toward Julia's career as a whole, framing her comments with humor that felt increasingly pointed. Subtle remarks turned into sharper observations. Whoopi leaned back and commented on Julia's long career, suggesting that many of her roles felt repetitive. The room grew noticeably quieter as the words settled in. Julia's smile tightened, but she remained composed, responding with grace and professionalism. She explained that each role held personal meaning and that she approached every character with care and intention. Rather than easing off, Whoopi pressed further. Her tone grew more dismissive, implying that Julia had relied too heavily on her charm, rather than range or risk. The audience shifted uneasily, sensing the discomfort spreading across the table. The other hosts exchanged glances, unsure whether to intervene or let the exchange run its course. Julia defended her work calmly, listing the diverse projects she had chosen and the directors she had collaborated with over the years. She spoke about choosing stories that resonated with her on a personal level rather than chasing expectations. Her voice remained steady, but the strain beneath it was beginning to show. Whoopi responded with visible skepticism, brushing aside Julia's explanation and labeling her image as carefully manufactured. She suggested that Julia's public persona overshadowed any authenticity in her performances. The air in the studio grew heavy, and even the camera crew appeared tense, unsure how far the exchange might go. Julia's cheeks flushed as she continued to hold her ground. She spoke about sincerity, about connecting with audiences through honesty and emotion. Her words were measured, but the emotion behind them was undeniable. Whoopi, however, mocked the idea, laughing sharply and questioning whether Julia saw herself as an artist or simply a marketable product. Silence followed each remark, stretching longer than usual for live television. The audience sat frozen, absorbing every word. Julia answered by describing herself as someone deeply grateful for her career and the opportunities she had been given. Her voice trembled slightly, revealing the impact of the relentless criticism. Whoopi countered with biting sarcasm, suggesting that gratitude was easy when success came with enormous paychecks and little effort. The implication that Julia's work required no real skill struck a nerve. At that moment, Julia's calm exterior finally fractured. She spoke firmly, demanding respect and questioning the hostility she was facing. The shift in her tone startled the room. Whoopi responded with equal intensity, accusing Julia of deceiving the public with a false image and lacking sincerity behind the fame. Gasps rippled through the audience as the exchange crossed into personal attack. Professional boundaries had dissolved completely. Julia's hands shook as she gathered herself, her expression a mix of anger and disbelief. She stated clearly that she had come to discuss her work, not to endure personal insults fueled by unresolved resentment. The tension was overwhelming, hanging thick in the studio. As the moment spiraled beyond repair, Honey, I don't even know you well enough to have anything personal against you. Oh, I simply say what I see, and what I see is someone who has been surviving on old success for far too long. That was the moment when the rest of the panel finally tried to step in. Joy attempted to crack a joke to ease the tension, but Whoopi silenced her instantly with a sharp glance. Another host tried to steer the discussion back toward Julia's film, hoping to salvage the interview, but Whoopi refused to let it go. No, absolutely not, she said, flicking her hand dismissively. For once, we're actually having a real conversation. Julia keeps talking about truth and authenticity, so let's actually address that. Let's talk about how someone can earn millions playing nearly the same part again and again and still claim to be a serious actress. Julia's hands tightened around the arms of her chair until her knuckles turned pale. She leaned forward slightly, her jaw set. She said she didn't need to sit there and be spoken to like that. Whoopi smiled coldly and leaned in as well, reminding her that this was live television and walking away would only prove she couldn't handle honest criticism. That was the instant when the mood in the studio shifted completely. Julia Roberts, one of Hollywood's most admired stars, was no longer part of a tense interview. She was being openly dismantled on national television by someone who is supposed to be a peer. The audience felt it immediately, the uncomfortable realization that this had crossed from awkward into deeply unsettling. Julia's eyes burned with the same intensity that had once filled movie theaters around the world. She pushed back, saying that what was happening wasn't criticism at all, but an ambush. She pointed out that real critique was meant to be constructive, not a series of personal insults disguised as professional opinion. Whoopi responded with biting sarcasm, insisting she was only asking the questions everyone else was afraid to say out loud. She challenged Julia to name the last time she had taken a real risk or surprised anyone. Julia fired back without hesitation, her composure finally gone. She said that every project carried risk, that vulnerability on screen wasn't easy, and that trusting an audience required courage. Her voice carried an edge that made it clear she was done absorbing the blows quietly. The remarks struck a nerve. Whoopi's expression hardened, and she demanded to know what Julia was implying. Julia didn't hesitate. She said that maybe someone who had spent decades sitting behind a table commenting on other people's work shouldn't be lecturing anyone about artistic risk or growth. Growth. A collective gasp rippled through the studio. The other hosts looked frozen, wishing they could disappear as the confrontation exploded beyond control. Whoopi's voice dropped into something icy and controlled as she asked if her credibility as an actress was being questioned. Oh, cool. Julia answered plainly, saying she was questioning the right to tear someone down while no longer actively creating meaningful work. She added that criticizing from the sidelines was easy. Whoopi shot to her feet so abruptly that her chair rolled backward. She rattled off her accolades, reminding everyone of her awards and the barriers she had broken long before Julia's rise to fame. Julia stood as well, refusing to be physically or verbally intimidated. She asked when those accomplishments had last been put to use creatively, instead of being used as shields while attacking others. The tension in the room was electric. Security edged closer to the set, unsure whether intervention would be necessary. In the control room, producers scrambled, debating whether to cut to commercial. Accusing her of being handed everything effortlessly, of riding the success of one romantic role for decades while others had to fight for every opportunity. Julia laughed bitterly and pushed back hard. She said she had faced rejection, doubt, and criticism like anyone else, and that her smile didn't mean her success was unearned. Whoopi shook her head in visible disgust, mocking that very smile and calling it manufactured, suggesting it was something practiced rather than genuine. Julia snapped back, accusing Whoopi of bitterness and jealousy, attacking people who were still actively working. She called the situation pathetic and labeled Whoopi herself as such. The studio erupted into chaos. The audience sat in stunned silence, while the other hosts all began speaking at once, desperately trying to regain control. Neither woman paid them any attention. Whoopi's voice rose again, sharp and dangerous, as she denied any jealousy. She mocked Julia's career as predictable and accused her of being incapable of disappearing into a role because of her ego. Julia's voice shook with fury as she repeated the accusation back, her anger now completely unrestrained. This coming from someone who has managed to turn nearly every discussion on this show into a spotlight on herself for the last decade and a half. You never let anyone else fully have their moment because you can't stand the idea of not being the focus. At that point, Joy Behar finally broke through the chaos, raising her hands and urging everyone to pause, reminding them they were live on television. Her plea barely landed. Whoopi refused to look away from Julia, her expression locked in defiance. She insisted that if her career was up for debate, then it was time to talk about it openly. She claimed she had never shied away from controversial roles, complex characters, or stories that carried weight. She accused Julia of hiding behind glamour and romance, implying fear of showing who she truly was. Julia's voice rose in response, sharp and unrestrained. She said Whoopi had no idea who she really was, and accused her of seeing only what fit a preconceived narrative. Preconceived narrative. She rejected the image of being a pampered princess who had never worked for her success, calling it completely false. Whoopi pushed back instantly, declaring that from her perspective, Julia was exactly what she had described, a carefully constructed brand, America's sweetheart, more invested in preserving an image than evolving as an artist. Julia's tone shifted suddenly, becoming calm in a way that chilled the room. It killed the room. She said she finally understood what was really happening. This wasn't about her career, her choices, or her authenticity. It was about insecurity, about feeling threatened by someone who had remained relevant without becoming bitter or cruel. Whoopi's face twisted with fury as she snapped back, dismissing Julia as outdated, a symbol of an era when charm and beauty were enough. She claimed the industry had moved on, leaving Julia behind. Julia responded immediately, pointing out the irony. If the industry had truly moved on from her, why was she sitting there promoting a new film while Whoopi remained behind a table dissecting other people's lives? The words hit hard. Whoopi's hands clenched into fists, her body tense as if she might physically react. Sire. She shot back that Julia had no understanding of what she was talking about, boasting that she had forgotten more about acting than Julia would ever know. Julia didn't hesitate. She suggested that maybe it was time for Whoopi to remember some of that knowledge instead of using her platform to tear down people who were still actively creating. Another host tried desperately to direct the conversation back to the film, praising it and attempting to restore some professionalism. Whoopi shut it down flatly, declaring that the conversation wasn't over. She accused Julia of coming onto her show to insult her and insisted she would now say exactly what she thought. Julia laughed bitterly and corrected her, pointing out that it wasn't Whoopi's show at all. It was The View, though it rarely felt that way. She accused Whoopi of being incapable of sharing the spotlight with anyone else. Whoopi fired back, saying she didn't need to share anything with someone who had been running on fumes for years. The insult was delivered with venom. Julia's voice dropped to a quiet, lethal tone. She said she was there working, passionately promoting a film she believed in, while Whoopi sat in the same chair, day after day, discussing other people's accomplishments, because she had no recent ones of her own to talk about. The entire studio seemed to stop breathing. This was no longer a heated exchange. It was something far darker, a public dismantling unfolding live. Whoopi's voice climbed toward a scream as she challenged Julia to talk about accomplishments. She mocked Julia's recent work, questioning whether anyone could even remember the titles of her last few films. That remark shattered the last remnants of restraint. Julia, who had spent decades handling interviews with grace and absorbing criticism with professionalism, finally reached her limit. The expression on her face shifted into one of pure disgust and disappointment. When she spoke again, her voice was steady, clear, and devastatingly controlled. She said she had come expecting a conversation with a colleague, perhaps even someone she respected. Instead, she had found a bitter, jealous person so threatened by the success of others that she needed to tear them down on national television just to feel better about herself. Whoopi appeared stunned, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to respond. She clearly hadn't anticipated such a precise and cutting rebuke. She managed to mutter a protest, demanding how Julia dared to speak to her that way. Julia stepped closer to the table, refusing to back down. She said she dared to defend herself after enduring relentless humiliation. She dared to call out behavior that had been completely unacceptable. She labeled it exactly what it was: disgraceful. The other host remained frozen, watching the confrontation unfold with disbelief. No one interrupted. No one moved. What was happening in front of them felt irreversible. A moment that would linger far beyond the studio walls. Joy's jaw hung open in disbelief. Sunny looked moments away from tears, her eyes glassy as she stared at the scene unfolding. Even the camera operators appeared frozen, captivated by the chaos playing out in front of them. When Whoopi spoke again, accusing Julia of coming onto her show to disrespect her, the strength that had fueled her earlier attacks was gone. The confidence in her voice had thinned, shaken by Julia's relentless and precise response. Julia let out a short laugh, empty of any amusement. She said she hadn't disrespected anyone and had merely responded to an attack that came out of nowhere. She reminded Whoopi that this entire situation had been created deliberately, turning what should have been a straightforward interview into something personal and hostile. She demanded to know what she had ever done to deserve being treated. As Whoopi prepared to answer, Julia raised her hand, stopping her cold. She said there was no need to respond because the truth was obvious. She hadn't done anything wrong. This had nothing to do with her at all. It was about Whoopi and whatever unresolved anger or frustration she was carrying. Julia speculated calmly that maybe it stemmed from feeling left behind or watching others continue to succeed while sitting behind the same desk every day. She made it clear that she no longer cared about the reason. The silence in the studio was overwhelming. The low hum of the air conditioning seemed unnaturally loud as the audience sat motionless. Julia continued, her voice growing steadier and more powerful with each sentence. She said she would not sit there and be treated like an emotional punching bag, nor would she smile through cruelty just because the cameras were rolling. She refused to give anyone the satisfaction of watching her break under that kind of behavior. Whoopi finally snapped back, insisting Julia had no right to speak to her that way and declaring it was her show. Julia corrected her instantly, saying it had been her show, but any credibility she once had was now gone. She asked whether Whoopi truly believed viewers would see her as the hero in this moment or respect the behavior they had just witnessed. Turning toward the camera, Julia addressed the audience directly. She explained that she had come to talk about a film centered on family, healing, and second chances, but instead found herself subjected to a deeply personal and unprofessional attack. When Whoopi tried to interrupt, Julia shut it down firmly, telling her she had already said more than enough. She accused Whoopi of revealing exactly who she was, describing it as small, mean, and petty. Julia reached for her purse beside her chair, and the movement sent a jolt through the studio. Everyone understood immediately what that gesture meant. Joy tried to intervene, pleading for calm, but Julia didn't look at her. She said she had been patient and professional while enduring humiliation, and she was finished extending courtesy to someone who didn't deserve it. Whoopi warned her that walking away would be a mistake, though her voice now trembled with uncertainty. Julia calmly replied that the only thing she regretted was not leaving sooner. She told Whoopi she should be ashamed, saying the behavior on display was beneath the person she believed Whoopi once was. When Whoopi muttered that she didn't have to listen to this, Julia agreed, but reminded her that everyone else was listening and would remember exactly how a guest had been treated. She said viewers would remember the cruelty, the lack of professionalism, and the choice to take the lowest possible path when a higher one was available. Julia stepped away from the table and turned to the other hosts, telling Joy and Sunny it was good to see them and apologizing that they had been forced to witness what had just happened. She then faced Whoopi one last time, expressing genuine hope that she would confront whatever was driving her behavior, because it wasn't who she used to be, and certainly not who she should want to become. With that, Julia turned and walked toward the exit. The camera followed as she crossed the studio floor, her posture steady, her composure intact despite everything that had occurred. Someone called after her, but she didn't stop. Near the edge of the set, Julia paused briefly and looked back. She apologized to viewers who had hoped to hear about her film, explaining that sometimes standing up for oneself mattered more than promotion. Then she left the set completely, leaving behind stunned silence, shaken hosts, and a visibly rattled Whoopi. The camera lingered on Whoopi as she sank back into her chair, the reality of the moment settling heavily on her shoulders. The other hosts exchanged anxious looks, unsure how to proceed. The audience remained silent, having witnessed something raw and unsettling, far beyond the usual bounds of daytime television. Joy finally cleared her throat, nervously acknowledging how unexpected the moment had been. Whoopi said nothing. She stared at the empty chair where Julia had been sitting, the consequences of her actions beginning to sink in. The damage was irreversible. The words had been spoken, the moment had been broadcast, and millions had seen it unfold. In the control room, producers scrambled to salvage the remainder of the show, but it was already clear nothing else would matter. As the program cut to commercial, the studio remained eerily still. The confrontation was over, but its impact would linger far beyond that broadcast. What began as a routine appearance had become a defining moment, exposing the limits of patience, the cost of cruelty, and the consequences of crossing lines that should never have been crossed.